You might look at this lush planted tank and think it's thriving at its best. But hold on, there's a twist. There's one thing about it that's preventing it from reaching its full potential, and that's because there are too many plants in this tank. Which isn't ideal, but plants help filter out toxins and waste from the water. So wouldn't having more be a good thing? Not necessarily. Here's why. One of the biggest issues of an overly planted tank is simply distribution. Distribution of what? Distribution of these nuts, nutrients and CO2. I'll use the game Aquarium Designer to help illustrate why. Here we have a standard aquarium with a filter. When it comes to flow, you want it to go around the tank in an oval shape so it reaches every corner of the tank. This is especially critical when it comes to liquid fertilization and CO2 injection. After adding some plants, we have something that looks like this. Obviously, you can easily see as to why this might be a bad thing. But how about this setup? Let's also pretend that the bubbles from the filter are CO2 bubbles. By the way, there are plants behind the rocks. They are the same type as the one over here, but smaller because they're suffering. The reason can be found right here. When you look from above and observe the flow of water, we can see that the flow becomes weaker due to the plant's body blocking and preventing any CO2 and nutrients from reaching further. This is the same concept as a windbreak, where trees are strategically placed to create areas with less wind. When you see this happening, some might want to move the healthy stems to the suffering side or add more nutrients. This is a sound decision, but you will end up in the same situation. This is a current issue that I recently found out in my 12-gallon tank. You can see that the taller Rotala H raw is doing very well, but there are stunted stems around it, especially the ones that were trimmed. Now that I think about it, this is probably the main reason as to why my Pagostemon halfieri and HC Cuba got choked out alongside detritus buildup. You can see that the CO2 diffuser is right beside the behemoth amount of Rotala H raw that I had growing. They were taking up all of the CO2. This was very evident when looking at older footage where I kept the H raw shorter. One way to solve this is to create a slope that allows plants to gain access to those nutrients and CO2. Another tactic that will help is the placement of your CO2 diffuser if you're using one. If I switch the positions of my lily pipe and diffuser, the plants may have thrived even more. If the water was stagnant, nutrients can be depleted in certain areas, making it more difficult for plants to access what they need to grow. This could also lead to areas where algae is more prevalent. This does not mean that stagnant water is a bad thing. There is a multitude of reasons as to why some tanks should not have any flow or have weak flow. I've shown this tank of mine a multitude of times, but it's the first time I've succeeded with a wall-set tank with no filter. However, it's not as overcrowded as my current one. Overcrowding can lead to overshadowing of other plants, which can cause them to suffer and possibly lose lower leaves. This can contribute to ammonia buildup, which can have a detrimental impact. However, this isn't much of an issue if you're doing proper plant maintenance and strategically placing plants in ideal areas. However, there is one important aspect to take note of. That is something called the biological oxygen demand. BOD refers to the amount of oxygen required for microbial metabolism of organic compounds in water. In English, this means that living things need oxygen, and each need a required amount. Plants produce oxygen through photosynthesis during the day, but what about at night? Well, it's exactly the opposite. Instead of photosynthesis, it's respiration. Plants intake oxygen and release CO2 at night. This could be detrimental for livestock as they could suffocate at night. Yeah, you could add an air stone during this time, but it's not needed unless your fish are suffocating at the surface and you already have cut down on your plant mass. Apart from that, overgrowth can impact the amount of space for livestock to traverse. This isn't much of an issue when it comes to shrimp and the like, but it can stress out fish if they are getting bullied or something like that. Whether you believe this or not, there's actually a positive effect when it comes to an overly planted tank. It's an issue that a lot of people seem to have when it comes to stem plants, particularly the Rotala species. There's a lot of talk on how they can start to have horizontal growth or weeping growth. This is simply because they have a lot of space to spread out and grow. If you pack them a bit more tightly with other plants surrounding them, this will encourage them to grow more vertical. But other than that, there really isn't much when it comes to the positives, apart from aesthetic or breeding reasons. Yeah, you could say that more can help with preventing algae, but there are a lot of other variables that can contribute to that, such as plant growth speed, plant species, plant health, and not to mention the big three. The only way to really prevent this is to know how to control growth. This includes strategic pruning, plant selection, and the modification of growth regulators. Strategic pruning usually includes tactics such as trimming damaged algae-infested leaves, trimming leaves to prevent overshadowing, etc. Researching plants before purchasing them will give you the information needed on their physiology and their ideal placement location in the tank. As for growth regulators, this includes modifying lighting, nutrients, and CO2. There are a plethora of reasons that contribute to faster growth, such as using an EI-based fertilizing regime. I have a couple of videos about those subjects on my channel. However, there is still one more very important aspect when it comes to overgrowth and overplanting, and that is impulse control. As a person with ADHD, I can't help buying a plant that I've never heard of despite my tank being completely crowded. This is how I bought my Aponogeton Crispus purple, despite the tank being too shallow for it. I never heard of it before, and it's purple. Well, sometimes. But I digress. Researching and making a plant list of what you want has helped me quell this thirst. If you do purchase the plant, you will need to make sure that you can maintain it long term. One of the best ways to do that is knowing how to balance your planted tank. You can find out more in this video here.